The night of February 6, 1792, did not sound like a battle was imminent. There was no thunder of artillery preparation, no rattle of drums, and no shouting of orders. On the banks of the Kaveri River, deep in the heart of southern India, nearly 9,000 British regulars and East India Company sepoys stood in near total silence. The air was thick with the humid heat of the Deccan Plateau and the faint, metallic scent of oiled steel. Under the pale light of the moon, the silhouette of Seringapatam, the tiger's capital, loomed ominous and dark across the water. It was an island fortress, an impregnable jewel protected by a natural moat and a man-made nightmare known as the Bound Hedge, a thick forest of bamboo laced with thorns that acted as nature's own barbed wire. At 8:30 p.m., a command was whispered down the lines that would define the discipline of the British Army for the next century. The order was simple, terrifying, and absolute. Every soldier was to remove the flint from his musket. There would be no firing. There would be no reloading. In the dark confusion of the bamboo forests, a nervous trigger finger could alert the enemy and spark a chaotic firefight that would stall the advance. Lord Charles Cornwallis, the commander-in-chief, was gambling everything on the cold steel of the bayonet. He intended to walk his army straight into the mouth of the enemy defences in total silence, relying on shock, discipline, and the terrifying inability of his men to retreat or return fire. For the soldiers of the 71st, 72nd, and 74th Highlanders, standing shoulder to shoulder in their heavy wool red coats, this was a test of nerve unlike any other. They were not just fighting an army, they were fighting the reputation of the British Empire itself. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look at the man commanding the centre column. Lord Cornwallis was a figure haunted by the past. 11 years earlier, at Yorktown in 1781, he had been forced to surrender to George Washington, effectively ending British rule in the American colonies. The shadow of that defeat had followed him halfway across the globe. He was a man with a stained legacy, viewed by some as the general who lost America. Now, in India, he saw his path to redemption. He had reformed the East India Company's military, rooted out corruption, and improved logistics, determined to prove that British arms were still supreme. He was not leading from the rear in safety. That night, the Governor-General placed himself at the head of the centre column, marching into the dark alongside his men. Facing him was an adversary who respected neither the British crown nor the trading power of the company. Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. Tipu was no backward feudal lord. He was a modernizer, a student of warfare who had employed French advisors to train his infantry and cast his own artillery. His capital, Seringapatam, was a testament to his power, housing over 45,000 troops, heavy siege guns, and a weapon that terrified the European imagination: the iron-cased rocket. Tipu had adorned his soldiers in tiger-striped uniforms and filled his palace with mechanical tigers devouring redcoats. He had sworn never to become a vassal of the British, and for years he had checked their expansion with a mixture of diplomatic savvy and military ferocity. The British force arrayed against him was a hybrid machine. It consisted of around 22,000 regulars and 30,000 allies, though the heavy lifting of the assault would fall to the king's regiments and the disciplined sepoys of the Madras native infantry, while the Maratha and Hyderabadi cavalry allies, numbering over 10,000 horsemen, hovered on the periphery, mostly interested in looting. The core striking force was purely professional. As the clocks neared 11 p.m., the signal was given. The army split into 3 columns, the right under General William Meadows, the left under Colonel Maxwell, and the centre under Cornwallis himself. They stepped off into the darkness, boots crunching softly on the dry earth, moving toward the dense black line of the bamboo hedge. They were walking into a trap, heavily outnumbered, with empty muskets. The silence was heavy, but it would not last. The siege of Seringapatam had begun, and with it, the forging of a new kind of army, one that would eventually conquer India and defeat Napoleon. The first obstacle was not a stone wall or a deep trench, but a living, breathing barrier. The bound hedge of Seringapatam was a tactical nightmare, a dense belt of bamboo and thorny undergrowth that encircled the fortress defences. It had been cultivated for years specifically to break the cohesion of attacking formations. As the British columns reached the edge of this tangled wilderness, the utter silence began to fray. Pioneers, the combat engineers of the 18th century, moved to the front. With axes and heavy blades, they began to hack narrow corridors through the thicket. The sound of chopping wood echoed in the stillness, a rhythmic thudding that inevitably travelled to the ears of the Mysorean sentries waiting in the darkness beyond. Suddenly, the night was no longer black. It was painted in violent strokes of azure and orange. The Mysorean defenders launched blue lights, chemical flares that hissed into the sky and bathed the struggling British columns in a ghostly, exposing glow. The element of surprise had vanished. Now, the redcoats were illuminated targets, trapped in the narrow, claustrophobic tunnels they had cut through the bamboo. Then came the rockets. For the British soldier, accustomed to the predictable trajectory of a cannonball or the flat snap of a musket, the Mysorean rocket was a weapon of pure terror. Iron tubes packed with gunpowder and lashed to long bamboo stabilizing poles screeched through the air with an erratic, banshee-like wail. They didn't just explode, they careened off the ground, wildly unpredictable, smashing into the packed ranks of men and horses. The air filled with the smell of sulphur and the screams of the wounded, yet the British discipline held. Under strict orders, not a single musket shot rang out in return. The men gripped their bayonets tighter, lowered their heads against the storm of projectiles, and surged forward. In the centre, Lord Cornwallis pushed his men relentlessly. The decision to remove the flints was proving its worth. Had the soldiers stopped to fire back at the flashes in the dark, the attack would have stalled in the bamboo, turning the columns into stationary targets for Tipu's artillery. Instead, they acted as a moving human battering ram. They burst out from the other side of the hedge and fell upon the Mysorean redoubts with the bayonet. The fighting was visceral and close quarters, a frantic melee of stabbing steel and clubbed muskets. The Mysorean regulars, trained by French advisors to fight in European lines, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of the silent, rushing wave of redcoats. However, the chaos of the night attack was beginning to fracture the British plan. To the right, General William Meadows, a man known for his bravery but occasional lack of navigational sense, found himself in trouble. The right column had entered the bamboo hedge, but lost its bearings in the dark, thorny maze. Instead of supporting Cornwallis in the centre, Medows's force drifted, attacking the wrong redoubt, the Edgar, which was heavily defended. Valuable time was lost as the right column fought a separate bloody battle, completely cut off from the commander-in-chief. For a terrifying hour, Cornwallis was left exposed. He had broken through the first line of defences with the centre column, but without Meadows to secure his flank, he was vulnerable to a counterattack. The darkness that had concealed their approach now concealed the danger. Cornwallis halted his troops near the enemy camp, peering into the gloom, waiting for the reinforcements that were frantically hacking their way through the wrong section of the jungle. Meanwhile, on the left, Colonel Maxwell's column was moving with ruthless efficiency. Their objective was Carragort Hill, a dominant position overlooking the river. Scrambling up the rocky slopes under heavy fire, they drove the defenders back, securing the high ground. From this vantage point, Maxwell could look down upon the Kaveri River. The water was black and rushing, swirling around the rocky island fortress of Seringapatam. The first phase of the assault was over. The bound hedge had been breached, the outer redoubt silenced by the bayonet. But the hardest task lay ahead. The army now had to cross the river itself. The Kaveri was not merely a moat, it was a treacherous, rocky torrent, waist-deep in places and guarded by the massive guns of the fortress walls. And as the British soldiers looked toward the water, they realized the enemy was not retreating. Tipu Sultan was rallying his forces. The Tiger of Mysore was preparing to spring. The Kaveri River churned violently against the rocky shoals, a dark, rushing barrier separating the British army from the heart of Tipu Sultan's power. Under normal circumstances, crossing such a river at night would be a hazardous logistical operation. To do so under the guns of a fortress, while illuminated by enemy flares and harassed by rocket fire, bordered on the suicidal. Yet, the momentum of the assault allowed for no hesitation. If the British stopped now on the riverbanks, they would be slaughtered by the artillery zeroing in from the island walls. Colonel Maxwell, having secured the heights of Carrickcourt Hill on the left, watched as the vanguard of the army descended toward the water. The riverbed was treacherous, a maze of slippery rocks and shifting sands, with deep pools capable of swallowing a man weighed down by a scarlet coat, a knapsack, and a heavy brown Bess musket. The soldiers, realizing the strength of the current, instinctively adopted a tactic born of necessity. They linked arms, forming human chains that stretched into the black water. If one man stumbled, the line held him up. If the current threatened to sweep a soldier away, the collective weight of his comrades anchored him. As they waded in, the water rising to their waists and then their chests, the fortress of Seringapatam erupted. The walls, previously dark, flashed with the discharge of heavy ordnance. Cannonballs splashed geysers of water into the air, soaking the struggling men. The blue lights sizzled overhead, their eerie chemical glow reflecting off the churning surface of the river, turning the cavalry into a shimmering, exposed killing zone. In the centre, Lord Cornwallis found himself in a precarious position that nearly altered the course of history. While his forward battalions were splashing across to the island, the Governor-General remained on the north bank with a small reserve, waiting for General Meadows' lost right column to appear. Isolated in the darkness, Cornwallis was suddenly exposed. A detachment of Tipu's elite infantry, realizing the British commander was vulnerable, launched a ferocious counterattack. For a few desperate moments, the ruler of British India was fighting for his life in a chaotic skirmish. The discipline Cornwallis had instilled in his men was now the only thing standing between him and death or capture. His personal guard and the remaining reserve troops formed a tight perimeter, repelling the Mysorean charge with the bayonet. It was a stark illustration of the new style of command Cornwallis had introduced. The general was not a distant figure on a hill, but a combatant in the mud, sharing the immediate physical danger of the assault. Meanwhile, in the river, the vanguard reached the island. Wet, shivering and exhausted, the British soldiers scrambled up the opposite bank. They were now inside the enemy's territory, but their muskets were useless, the powder damp from the crossing, and the flints still removed from the hammers. They were effectively unarmed save for their 17-inch bayonets. Yet, the psychological impact of their arrival was devastating. The Mysorean defenders, seeing these red-coated demons emerge from the river like unstoppable wraiths, began to waver. The British did not stop to dry off or regroup. They immediately fanned out, storming the batteries and gun positions located on the island's perimeter. The silence that had marked the beginning of the attack was long gone, replaced by the roar of the fortress guns and the clash of steel. But the spirit of the bayonet continued to drive the advance. By the early hours of the morning, the situation was stabilizing. General Meadows, having finally extricated his column from the bamboo maze, linked up with Cornwallis. The reunited force pressed the advantage. They had done the impossible. They had breached the bound hedge, survived the rocket bombardment, crossed the Kaveri River, and established a firm foothold on the island of Seringapatam. As the sun began to rise over the Deccan Plateau, the full scale of the night's achievement became visible. The British controlled the outer defences. The city of Seringapatam lay before them, its white minarets and palace walls glowing in the morning light. But the battle was far from won. Tipu Sultan had retreated into the main fortress, and his army was still largely intact. The night attack had been a stunning tactical success, but now the British faced a grueling siege. They had to bring up the heavy guns, dig the trenches, and prepare to batter the tiger into submission. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition was about to begin. With the rising sun came a sober realization of the task that remained. The British had taken the island's outer precincts, occupying the majestic Lalbaj garden with its cypress trees and fountains, now trampled under the boots of exhausted infantry. But looming above them was the citadel itself. The fortress of Seringapatam was a formidable feat of military engineering, its walls bristling with cannon and its ramparts swarming with Tipu Sultan's best troops. The night for bayonets was over. The time for mathematics had arrived. Lord Cornwallis knew that storming the main citadel without artillery preparation would be a massacre. The British Army needed to shift gears instantly from the fluid chaos of a night raid to the rigid, methodical science of 18th century siege warfare. This was a process of geometry and labour, of angles and earthworks. However, a siege requires more than just gunpowder. It requires food. In previous campaigns in India, British armies had often dissolved not from enemy fire, but from starvation. The scorched earth tactics employed by Mysore usually left invading armies withering in the field, forced to retreat when their bellies emptied. But Cornwallis had learned the hard lessons of logistics. He had not come to Seringapatam relying on luck or local foraging. Behind the British lines, a sight unfolded that signalled the birth of a modern logistical machine. A vast, moving city of cattle and grain merchants arrived to support the troops. These were the Brinjaris, or Banjaras, hereditary nomadic traders whom Cornwallis had hired in massive numbers. Tens of thousands of bullocks, laden with sacks of rice and grain, plodded into the camp. It was a triumph of planning. Unlike the starving armies of the past, the force at Seringapatam was well fed and supplied, capable of sitting outside Tipu's walls for as long as necessary. This logistical dominance was the invisible weapon that broke the spirit of the resistance as surely as any cannonball. With his supply lines secure, Cornwallis ordered the engineers to begin their work. On February 7th, the digging started. The soldiers exchanged their muskets for picks and shovels, carving long trenches known as parallels into the red earth of the island. These trenches were designed to zigzag toward the fortress walls, protecting the men from the direct line of fire of the enemy guns. It was backbreaking, terrifying work. The pioneers dug under the constant harassment of Tipu's artillery. Every few minutes, the ground would shake as a heavy iron ball slammed into the earthworks, showering the diggers with dirt and stone. But the British line crept inexorably forward, tightening the noose around the capital. As the trenches moved closer, the heavy battering train was brought forward. These were the 24-pounder siege guns, massive iron beasts dragged by teams of elephants and bullocks. Unlike the lighter field pieces used in open battles, the 24-pounders were designed for one purpose: deconstruction. They were the sledgehammers of the empire. Once positioned in the newly dug batteries, they began a rhythmic, thundering bombardment. Day and night, the air was filled with the deafening roar of the British guns. The objective was not to kill the soldiers on the walls, but to kill the walls themselves. The gunners focused their fire on specific sections of the masonry, hammering the same spot repeatedly to weaken the structure. The stone began to chip, then crack, and finally crumble, sliding down into the ditch in avalanches of dust. Inside the fortress, the situation for Tipu Sultan was becoming desperate. He had lost the outer defences, his rockets could not stop the trenching, and his walls were being pulverised. But the Tiger of Mysore was not passive. He directed return fire personally, his artillery chief straining to knock out the British batteries. Yet, with every hour, the British parallels moved closer, and their aim became truer. The psychological pressure was immense. The defenders could hear the digging at night, the sound of their own doom approaching, shovelful by shovelful. The siege was stripping away the illusion of Mysorean invincibility, revealing the cold, industrial power of the modernized British military machine. By February 23rd, the mathematics of destruction had reached their conclusion. The relentless pounding of the 24-pounders had done its work. A section of the fortress wall, once a sheer face of stone, had been reduced to a jagged slope of rubble, a practicable breach. In the lexicon of siege warfare, this was the death knell of a fortress. It meant that infantry could now scramble up the debris and enter the city without ladders. The geometry was complete, the time for slaughter had returned. Inside the British lines, the mood shifted from the drudgery of digging to a dark anticipation. The officers began to organise the storming parties. They called for volunteers for the forlorn hope. The suicide squad, tasked with being the first men into the breach to draw the enemy's fire. Despite the near certainty of death, there was never a shortage of volunteers among the British ranks. Promotion and glory waited for the survivors, while the rest of the army looked forward to the grim prize that awaited a successful storm: the sack of the city. The laws of war in the 18th century were brutal but clear. If a fortress capitulated before the walls were breached, the garrison and civilians were spared. But if the attackers were forced to storm the breach, the city was forfeit. The soldiers, adrenaline-fueled and vengeful after weeks of sniping and rocket fire, would be unleashed to loot, burn, and kill without restraint. High on the ramparts of Seringapatam, Tipu Sultan looked down at the rubble ramp leading into his capital. He watched the British trenches filled with redcoats sharpening their bayonets. He saw the Highlanders of the 71st and 74th Regiments, men who had already proven they could cross rivers and storm redoubts in the dark. The Tiger of Mysore was a proud man, a ruler who had dreamt of driving the British into the sea. But he was not a fool. He looked at the breach, then back at his city, at his palace, his people, and his family. The realization was bitter. His French advisors were gone or helpless. His cavalry was neutralized. His walls were broken. To continue the fight now was not courage, it was suicide. The modern British Army, with its terrifying blend of logistical unlimitedness and infantry discipline, had him by the throat. On February 24, 1792, just as the British were making their final preparations to unleash the storming parties, the guns fell silent. A hush descended over the battered landscape, stranger and heavier than the roar of the bombardment. From the fortress, a small procession emerged under a flag of truce. The order to cease fire rippled down the British lines. The soldiers, many of whom had been mentally preparing to kill or die in the breach, lowered their weapons. The sudden quiet revealed the devastation of the last few weeks. The pockmarked earth, the splintered bamboo of the bound hedge, and the smell of unburied bodies rotting in the tropical heat. Tipu Sultan had sued for peace. The negotiations that followed were conducted not in a palace, but in a tent pitched on the open ground, symbolizing the shifting power dynamic. Lord Cornwallis, the victor, held all the cards. He did not demand Tipu's life, nor total annexation. The East India Company was not yet ready to administer the whole of Mysore. Instead, he demanded a punishment designed to cripple Tipu's military capability and strip him of his honor. The terms were draconian. Tipu was to cede half of his vast territory to the British and their allies. He was to pay a massive war indemnity of 33 million rupees. But the final condition was the most personal: a knife twisted into the heart of the Sultan. To ensure the payment and compliance of the treaty, Tipu was forced to hand over 2 of his sons as hostages. For the British soldiers watching from the trenches, the war was effectively over. They had survived the rockets and the river. But for the history of the British Empire, the most dramatic scene was yet to play out. The surrender of the princes would be a piece of theatre meticulously choreographed by Cornwallis, a moment intended to display the benevolence and absolute superiority of the new British Raj. On February 26, 1792, the battlefield of Seringapatam was transformed from a slaughterhouse into a stage for one of the most poignant pieces of theatre in imperial history. The sun beat down on the scorched earth, but the roar of the 24-pounders had been replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Thousands of soldiers, British redcoats, Scottish Highlanders, and Indian sepoys lined the route from the fortress gates to the main British camp. They stood at attention, their uniforms cleaned of the mud and blood of the trenches, their muskets presented in a rigid salute. They were witnesses to the final humiliation of the Tiger of Mysore. At noon, the heavy gates of the citadel swung open. A gasp went through the assembled ranks as the procession emerged. It was not a column of defeated soldiers surrendering their arms, but a train of 7 caparisoned elephants, shimmering with gold and silver trappings. On the lead elephant, seated in a silver howdah, rode 2 small boys. They were Prince Abdul Khalik, aged 10, and Prince Muizuddin, aged 8. Tipu Sultan, the man who had terrified the British populace with tales of his mechanical tigers and rocket corps, had remained behind the walls. He could not bear to watch. Instead, he stood atop the ramparts, a solitary figure looking down as his beloved sons were carried away into the camp of his enemy. The surrender of the princes was the ultimate guarantee of the treaty, human collateral ensuring that the crippling indemnity would be paid. As the elephants plodded closer to the British headquarters, the contrast was striking. The princes were dressed with heartbreaking elegance, long robes of white muslin, red turbans adorned with sprigs of pearls, and necklaces of precious gems that caught the sunlight. Their faces were solemn, masking the terror they must have felt entering the camp of the men who had spent the last month trying to destroy their home. Lord Cornwallis waited outside his tent to receive them. This was the moment he had curated carefully. He was not there to play the vengeful conqueror, but the benevolent patriarch. As the boys dismounted, the British guns fired a 19-gun salute, a mark of respect usually reserved for sovereign rulers. The vakils, the Mysorean envoys accompanying the children, bowed low before the Governor-General. With trembling voices, they delivered the line that had been scripted by the circumstances of their defeat. These children were this morning the sons of the Sultan, my master. They must now look up to your lordship as their father. Cornwallis, a man who had lost his own wife years earlier and was known for a certain melancholic stoicism, took the hands of the young princes. In a gesture that was immediately immortalized in paintings and engravings across Britain, he led them into his tent, seating them on either side of him. He assured the envoys that the boys would be treated not as prisoners, but as his own family. The psychological impact of this scene on the army was profound. The hardened soldiers of the 74th Highlanders and the Madras Native Infantry, men who had hacked their way through the bamboo hedge and waded through the bullet-swept cavalry, were reported to have been visibly moved. The sight of the two royal children, dignified yet vulnerable, softened the rage of the siege. But beneath the sentimentality lay a cold political reality. This ceremony was the final nail in the coffin of Mysore's dominance. By taking the princes, Cornwallis had publicly gelded the tiger. He had demonstrated that the reach of the British army was absolute. They could breach the unbreachable walls, silence the rockets, and now they could take the very future of the dynasty into their custody. The boys were given a dedicated household within the British lines, complete with their own servants and tutors. They became celebrities of a sort, living symbols of British power. For Tipu Sultan, the loss was a torment that would fester. He would pay the indemnity with frantic speed, stripping his treasury to buy back his sons the following year. But he would never forgive the humiliation. The peace of 1792 was merely an interlude. The modern British army had been forged in this victory, but the war for India was not yet done. The tiger was wounded, not dead, and in the shadows of Seringapatam, he began to plot a revenge that would eventually bring the British back to these walls 7 years later. The Treaty of Seringapatam brought a temporary peace to the Deccan, but its significance lay far deeper than the borders drawn on a map or the rupees counted in the company treasury. The campaign of 1792 had fundamentally altered the DNA of the British Army. Before this siege, British expeditions in the interior of India were often gambling ventures. Fragile columns of infantry venturing into hostile territory, perpetually 1 week away from starvation, dependent on unreliable local alliances, and prone to heatstroke and disease. Lord Cornwallis had changed the equation. He had turned war into an industrial process. The primary revelation was logistical. For centuries, armies in India had lived off the land, looting villages to survive. This made them slow and hated by the peasantry. Cornwallis, however, had perfected the system of the Brinjaris. By integrating these hereditary grain merchants and their hundreds of thousands of bullocks directly into the military structure, he created a self-sustaining ecosystem. The British Army was no longer a wandering predatory beast. It was a mobile city that carried its own survival with it. This innovation meant that British commanders could now campaign in any season, across any terrain, without the fear of their army dissolving from hunger. It was a lesson that would be studied intently by a young colonel arriving in India just 5 years later. Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Tactically, the silent storm of February 6th had proven the supremacy of discipline over individual fervour. The decision to remove flints and rely on the bayonet was not just a quirk of the night. It became a doctrinal preference. The British infantry learned that holding fire until the last possible second, followed by a coordinated shock charge, was more devastating than any long-range duel. This cold steel philosophy forged a level of unit cohesion that was terrifying to behold. Regiments like the 74th Highlanders had walked through rocket fire and waded through rivers without breaking rank. They had become a machine. Furthermore, the siege cemented the role of the sepoy. The Madras native infantry had fought alongside the king's regiments not as auxiliaries, but as equals. They had stormed the redoubts and dug the trenches with the same stoic professionalism as their European counterparts. Seringapatam proved that an Indian soldier, drilled in European tactics and led by British officers, was the most cost-effective and lethal instrument of empire building available. The East India Company now possessed a formula for infinite expansion. Local manpower, funded by local taxes, commanded by British discipline. As the army packed up its camp and began the long march back to Madras, it was a different beast than the one that had arrived. It was harder, leaner, and infinitely more confident. The officers who cut their teeth in the bamboo hedges of Seringapatam, men like Baird and Harris, were now veterans of a new kind of warfare. They understood that the path to victory in the East lay not in dash and glory, but in bullocks, rice bags, heavy siege guns, and the silent, terrifying discipline of the line. As the dust settled on the roads leading away from Seringapatam, the East India Company marched back to its coastal strongholds, richer, stronger, and more feared than ever before. But the story of this siege did not end with the return of the hostages or the payment of the indemnity. The events of February 1792 had set in motion a chain of causality that would stretch across oceans and decades, influencing the fate of Europe itself. Tipu Sultan, humiliated and stripped of half his kingdom, did not fade into obscurity. In the silence of his reduced palace, he nursed a burning grievance. He rebuilt his army with frantic energy, seeking alliances with the French Republic and the Ottoman Empire. He turned Seringapatam into an even more formidable fortress, believing that next time the walls would hold. But he had miscalculated the nature of his enemy. The British had not just defeated him, they had evolved. 5 years after Cornwallis's victory, a new officer arrived in India, a harsh-nosed, aristocratically aloof colonel named Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Wellesley was a keen student of his predecessors. He studied Cornwallis's 1792 campaign with forensic intensity. He noted the success of the night attack, the discipline of the silent advance, and most importantly, the miracle of the bullock supply trains. When the British returned to finish the job in 1799, Wellesley was there, commanding the reserve. The final siege was bloody and decisive. The British stormed the breach once more, but this time there was no treaty. Tipu Sultan died fighting near the Watergate, weapon in hand, a warrior's death that cemented his legend. With his fall, the last great barrier to British hegemony in South India collapsed. However, the true legacy of Seringapatam was not the territory gained, but the weapon forged. When Arthur Wellesley eventually returned to Europe to face the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, he brought with him the lessons of the Deccan. The Sepoy General, as Napoleon dismissively called him, applied the Indian system to the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal. While French armies under Napoleon's marshals starved in the Spanish countryside, forced to scatter to forage for food, Wellington's army remained concentrated and lethal. Why? Because he utilized the same logistical principles Cornwallis had pioneered outside Seringapatam. He understood that a well-fed soldier is a disciplined soldier. The massive supply trains that trailed Wellington through the Iberian Peninsula were the direct spiritual successors to the Brinjaris of 1792. Furthermore, the tactical doctrine of the thin red line, the reliance on steady, silent volleys followed by a bayonet charge, was perfected in the heat of India. The nerves of steel required to stand firm against a French cavalry charge at Waterloo were tempered in the bamboo hedges of Mysore, standing against the rockets and the tigers of Tipu Sultan. The siege of Seringapatam in 1792 was, therefore, the crucible of the modern British army. It was the moment the East India Company ceased to be a disparate collection of merchants and mercenaries and transformed into a continental land power. It proved that the British could project power deep inland, far from the support of the Royal Navy. It demonstrated that logistics won wars, that discipline conquered numbers, and that the bayonet, when wielded by men who refused to break, was the ultimate arbiter of battle. Today, the island of Seringapatam is a quiet place. The Kaveri River still flows over the rocky shoals where the soldiers linked arms in the dark. The breach in the walls is still visible, a scar in the masonry that marks the end of an era. But the echoes of that night in February 1792 resonate far beyond the banks of the river. They echo in the drill manuals of the Victorian Army, in the strategy rooms of the Napoleonic Wars, and in the history of an empire that was built, quite literally, on the lessons learned in the tiger's den. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.